The first human she ever touched without a glove was a child. Not intentionally. The boy, 7 years old, maybe 8, with a smear of engine grease across his nose and eyes that had already developed the habit of seeing everything before commenting on anything, had simply grabbed her hand while she was crouching near a sample core on the lower drill platform. Just grabbed it. Both of his small hands wrapped around her long manipulator fingers and held on, the way a child holds something they want to show you somewhere. The way you grab a person when the thing you want them to see is more interesting than the possibility of permission. He wanted to show her a beetle. It was in the loose clay at the edge of the core tray, bright green, the exact precise color of new copper, with a carapace that caught the early morning light and fractured it into something too iridescent to be accidental. A living jewel sitting in 65-million-year-old mud like it had been placed there by someone with a sense of drama. Velnara this had gone very still. She had been told, during the orientation session on her first day, attached to the Interspecies Survey and Resource Consortium's long-spine geological operation, that human children were tactile creatures, that they did not maintain the standard spatial separation protocols, that they would touch you and it was not aggression, it was not a territorial gesture, it was simply how they processed the world. Hands first, words after, questions eventually. She had been told all of this by the site coordinator, Dev Osai, who had delivered the information in the measured tone of a man who had learned things the hard way and was trying to spare someone else the learning. Nothing he had said had prepared her for the warmth. Her homeworld, Keth Solis, was not a cold planet by any objective metric. The equatorial band ran warm. The two dominant seasons were distinguished by degree of warmth rather than by contrast, but the Vises themselves were cold in a different sense, not in temperature but in contact. Her species did not touch one another outside of 3 contexts: formal bonding ceremonies, medical procedures with explicit consent, and combat. To place your hand on another Vises without established permission was not simply rude. It was a violation with historical precedent in the legal codes, an act that had, in certain centuries, been grounds for formal grievance escalation. She had grown up understanding that the space around her body was sovereign territory. The air around you was yours. No one entered it. No one was supposed to want to. The boy had simply reached up, grabbed her hand and pulled. Gently, he was not a rough child. He pulled the way you pull someone toward a window when the light is doing something beautiful outside, urgently, but with care for the person being led. She let herself be led. They both crouched over the beetle. She said very carefully, "It is quite beautiful." He looked at her with a flash of gratitude that suggested he had encountered some skepticism on this point before. "Most bugs are," he told her. "People don't look right." "How do you mean?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "They look at them wrong," he said finally, "like they're already deciding." She thought about this for a long time afterward. She thought about it while she was filing her core sample reports. She thought about it while she was adjusting her sensor array calibrations. She thought about it in the colony cafeteria, eating the meal she always ate at her corner table, alone, because the appropriate way to interact with colonists during off hours was not something her orientation had covered clearly, and the ambiguity made her cautious. Looking at things wrong, like you're already deciding. That was 17 months ago, before the drilling, before they cracked open the Cretaceous layer, before everything that came out of it. Her full designation was Velnara of House Vises, 3rd Survey Rank, Xenogeology Division, deployed under Consortium Contract 7 SL 4419 to the Geological Extraction Operation on Colony World SL7. The humans had named their world Carthage, which she had initially assumed was aspirational and had later been informed was ironic, because the colony had started as a mining venture in a mountain range they called the Long Spine and had gradually become a home, which was the thing the original Carthage had been before it was burned. Humans, she had found, maintained a complex relationship with their own history of catastrophe. They named things after fallen cities. They built in places that had broken before. They told stories about disasters with something that looked, from the outside, very much like fondness. The long spine stretched roughly 300 kilometers from northwest to southeast, a compressed basaltic uplift from a tectonic event 40 million years prior. The survey team was working in its central section, where the Cretaceous strata were most accessible. The geological accident of a thrust fault had brought layers that should have been 2 kilometers underground up to within 200 meters of the surface, and the consortium had been drilling into them for 4 years before Velnara's arrival, and she had been there for 17 months. And in all of that time, the core samples had been telling a story she found genuinely fascinating. SL7 had been, 65 million years ago, a warm and wet world. The pollen record was extraordinary. Flower species with no living relatives. Tree root impressions from trees whose biological descendants had not survived whatever extinction event had ended SL7's Cretaceous period. And among those botanical records, occasionally, the chitin impression of an arthropod, sometimes a jaw fragment. Occasionally, a section of exoskeleton that the biology consultants on the consortium's advisory board would examine for weeks, writing papers about the locomotion mechanics of a creature that had not walked this world for 65 million years. No one had considered the possibility that one of those creatures might have waited. No one had a framework for it. No one had ever found a data point for it. You found the impressions, the chemical traces, the fossilized remnants. You dated them and cataloged them and wrote your papers. The idea that the living animal might be present in the rock was not a hypothesis that existed in anyone's working model of the world. She had been the one to crack the core on the morning of the 17th month. Standard procedure. Not hurried, not careless. She had done it 400 times. Extract the cylinder of compressed ancient rock from the bore casing, mount it on the laser cutter housing, set the alignment guides, run the cut. 2 perfect halves of geological time, each one a record of everything the world had been and forgotten. She had been tired, not badly, just the background tired of a long project in its final quarter, the tired of someone who had been producing thorough, careful work for 17 months and could feel the end of the contract approaching on the calendar like a mild weather event. She'd been thinking about the survey report due at the end of the week. She'd also been thinking about the coffee that Dev Osai had left at her workstation again that morning, the 3rd time this week, even though she had told him, twice now, specifically, that caffeine was not metabolized correctly by this physiology, and that drinking it gave her something that was the approximate neurological equivalent of being gently rattled in a box for 4 hours. Dev had listened to both explanations with the careful attention of a man who was taking notes. He had brought coffee again anyway. She had been trying to work out, for 3 weeks, whether this was a failure of retention or a human social gesture she was misunderstanding. The rock split cleanly. She examined the cut faces, annotating the strata visually, the lower Cretaceous limestone, the transition layer, the upper marker bed that was associated with the extinction event on every SL7 core she had processed. Standard sequence. Extremely standard. She was reaching for her annotation tool. Something moved. Not the rock, not a settling vibration from the machinery on the secondary platform, something inside the core. The faintest possible twitch, like the memory of movement, like muscle that had been still so long that the concept of motion had become theoretical. She had been still for about 10 seconds. Then she told herself she was tired and reached for the annotation tool again. The secondary bore shaft started up 300 meters north. The vibration moved through the rock shelf like a slow wave rolling through water, and something in the Cretaceous layer heard it, recognized it, not with a brain processing the concept of seismic vibration, but with something older than brains, some cellular memory encoded at the level of biochemistry, the oldest signal. Something is moving. Something is alive. Something is here. She learned later that it was the drilling vibration specifically that had triggered the response. The biological mechanism was still being debated by the science teams, but the working hypothesis was something analogous to dormancy break in terrestrial organisms, a specific sensory threshold, met by a specific stimulus, after which the metabolic arrest that had been holding the animal in something between life and geological time simply stopped holding. The rock that had been the secondary bore shaft wall came down. She heard it from the core processing station and went to look. She found 30 meters of fresh tunnel collapsed. And at the far end of the open chamber behind the collapse, in a cloud of white limestone dust that was still settling, something that was watching her. It was 12 meters long from thorax to the tip of its raptorial forearms. The exoskeleton was a mottled gray-green that shifted as it moved, the photonic adaptation of a creature that had spent an inconceivable number of generations perfecting the art of not being seen. The compound eyes were gold, faceted like cut gemstones, enormous, each eye nearly 2/3 the diameter of Velnara's entire torso. The raptorial arms were folded currently, drawn back against the anterior thorax in the posture she would later learn to recognize as evaluation rather than preparation, a creature that was looking at her and deciding. She had enough time to take in all of this detail with the particular clarity that comes when the nervous system understands, at a level beneath thought, that it may be taking in its last details. The kind of seeing that is pure and unsentimental because there is no room for anything else. The creature was extraordinary. She would come back to this thought later, would find it waiting for her in the quiet moments after the emergency, as though the moment of looking had impressed itself somewhere deeper than memory. The exoskeleton had a structural geometry that spoke to hundreds of millions of years of iterative refinement. Not a design, but a discovery. The shape that physics and time and the particular demands of hunting in a warm, wet world had collaboratively arrived at after longer than the human brain could comfortably hold. The raptorial forearms were articulated in a way that gave them a range of motion she had never seen in any documented arthropod species. The way they were folded against the thorax, not resting, not idle, but held, like a sentence paused mid-delivery, communicated something she would later have to describe to the science division and struggle to find clinical vocabulary for. Not threat she had written in that report, though threat was what she had felt. Something more considered than threat. Something that looked at her the way her best survey professors had looked at a geological formation they did not immediately recognize, with the full attention of a mind that had been doing this for a very long time and had not yet lost the capacity to be surprised. 65 million years in the rock, and it was looking at her like she was new. Then the creature took one step forward and she ran. Her radio was active. She hit the transmit key without slowing. "Dev, this is Vel. I am evacuating from the secondary bore access corridor. The tunnel shook, and behind her she heard the particular sound of something enormous beginning to move with intent. There is a large life form in the secondary bore chamber. Large. Approximately 12 meters. Moving. I need you to clear the secondary bore access routes and get the children off the site plateau. Do you copy?" Static then. "Vel, I copy, but what kind of life form the bore is?" "Cretaceous kind," she said, and the floor gave way. She fell 6 meters into a secondary drainage cavity and hit hard enough to crack 2 of her manipulator finger sheaths and something in her lower thorax that she classified provisionally as probably not the plate, hopefully not the plate, please not the plate. She lay on her back in the dark and ran a rapid self-assessment, both primary limbs functional, secondary limb digits on the left hand damaged but usable, sensor array showing intermittent. The crash had damaged the housing. Radio had signal in pulses. She was alive. Above her, through 6 meters of rock, something very large was moving through the corridor she had just vacated. She could feel it in her lateral line, the pressure-sensitive array along her lower thorax. That was one of the features of this physiology that humans generally found mildly unsettling when she explained it, because it made her aware of vibrations in the frequency range that sat just below human auditory threshold. She felt the creature moving the way you might feel a weather system, a diffuse and distant pressure that was not quite sound and not quite sensation, but somewhere in between. The creature was circling. She activated her emergency beacon, pulled herself to her feet in the dark, and started moving through the drainage cavity, following the slope of the rock by touch and the faint airflow that suggested a surface connection somewhere east. She had the geology memorized at a professional level. She knew the survey maps to a resolution of 5 meters. She knew the drainage system by inference from the core samples. This knowledge was, in this moment, the most valuable thing she possessed, more than her sensor array, more than her radio, more than any tool she carried. She also knew, as she moved, that there were 9 children currently on the dig site. She knew their names. She knew the order in which she had learned them. Petra first, because Petra had given her the mud. Then Corvin, because Corvin had introduced himself formally, with his full name and a handshake, because he had decided at some point that she was a professional colleague and should be treated as one. Then Sasha and the others in their various ways with their various gestures, through 17 months of proximity and the slow accumulation of knowing that happens when people share a place and a purpose long enough that the knowing becomes involuntary. She found the surface exit 43 minutes later. The crack in the limestone face was narrow enough that she had to exhale and compress herself sideways, which tore the sensor array housing completely free and left it somewhere inside the fissure. She came out into late afternoon light, the sun at a low angle, the long spine casting long purple shadows east, the jungle beginning about 200 meters upslope, and the colony base camp visible as small moving shapes maybe 1.5 kilometers below. She keyed her radio. "Dev, this is Vel. I am on the south face of the secondary bore ridge. I need a status on site personnel." Dev's voice came back with the particular quality of a man who was managing something actively and simultaneously managing himself. "Vel, okay, good to hear you. We have most adults are at the base camp perimeter. We have 3 children and 2 adults confirmed missing in the upper jungle sector." A pause. "The creature came up through the north ventilation shaft about 2 hours ago. It's been moving through the jungle. We've been tracking it on thermals, but the canopy coverage is degrading the signal." "Which children?" "Corvin Adami, Sasha Volkov, and little Petra followed them. We think she followed Corvin." His voice caught briefly and then steadied. "Adults are Myra Adami and Dex Volkov. They went in after the kids about 90 minutes ago. We've had no comms contact from any of them for the past 47 minutes. She looked at the jungle. It was dense at the upper elevations. The long spine's particular combination of altitude and moisture, producing a canopy that was nearly impenetrable by satellite or drone. Something she had noted in her geological survey reports as a complication for aerial core sample photography, and which she now noted as a complication of an entirely different order. She also looked at her hands. The left one was functional in a reduced capacity. The right one had a fracture pattern she could feel when she moved it that suggested it was not going to be reliable for significant grip tasks. Her sensor array was gone. Her secondary toolkit had fallen into the drainage cavity. She had 2 emergency flares in her right thigh pocket, which she could confirm by feel. She had her radio. She had the geology. She started climbing toward the jungle. The long spine's upper sector was not, Velnara understood from the survey maps, simply a dense jungle. It was a dense jungle sitting over a pipe organ made of lava. 3 million years prior, a period of sustained volcanism along the spine's central axis had produced an extensive system of subsurface tubes, cylindrical channels carved by lava flow, ranging from 2 meters to 12 meters in diameter, running in a generally east-west orientation that mirrored the prevailing tectonic stress of that period. When the volcanism had ended, the tubes had remained, hollow spaces in the rock, eventually colonized by groundwater, connected to the surface by a network of karst fissures and sinkholes that the jungle's root system had partially mapped for her by the way the trees grew. She had mapped these tubes. She had mapped the karst fissures. She had mapped the limestone plug at the north end of the primary north-south tube, a deposit formation from a cold water mineral spring that had been active for approximately 10,000 years before the spring dried, and the plug had continued to accrete without pressure relief. She had flagged the plug in her survey notes as a structurally interesting feature. She had noted the flaw line that ran along its eastern face, where the basalt intrusion met the limestone at an angle that put the compressive stress of the geological shift 2 million years prior into permanent, unresolved tension. She had not known when she flagged it what she would need to know it for. She moved through the lower canopy listening, not primarily with her auditory structures, the jungle noise, the wind in the upper canopy, the subsurface water movement in the lava tubes. All of it created a sound environment that was not useful for tracking a specific animal. She listened with her lateral line, felt the pressure signature of something massive moving through vegetation to her northeast, circling. The signature had a rhythm to it that she spent about 10 minutes studying while she moved, trying to characterize it. Patient, that was the first word. The movement was not driven, not hungry in the sense of urgency. This was a creature that had spent 65 million years inside rock without growing frantic. Urgency was not part of its behavioral vocabulary. What she was feeling was something more deliberate than hunger. Focus. It was tracking something. It had a fix on a specific location and it was circling it, maintaining orientation, not approaching directly because direct approach was not the technique for this kind of terrain. It was waiting for the thing it was tracking to move. It would wait as long as it took. She followed the circle. She found Myra Adami behind a basalt outcropping near a dry creek bed, wedged into a gap between two boulders that she had clearly identified as the best available defensive position, one hand pressed to a wound on her forearm that was bleeding in a controlled way. She had been applying pressure, the other hand holding a signal flare she had decided, correctly, not to light. Myra was 34 years old, a structural engineer who had worked on 4 colonial survey operations before this one, and she was afraid in the particular way that very competent people are afraid. Fully, precisely, without any of the panic that would have made it less functional. She looked at Velnara coming through the undergrowth and said, very quietly, "I was starting to think you were dead." I was underground. Velnara crouched beside her, the wound. Claw caught me when I was pulling Petra out of its path, messy but not deep. Myra looked at Velnara's hands. What happened to you? The drainage cavity. The children are ahead. 80 meters up the creek bed. There's a rock shelf. Corvin found it. He's been mapping the upper sector for a geology project. Her voice had something complicated in it, saying that, the particular mixture of worry and pride that Velnara had learned to recognize in parents. He got them under the shelf and he's been keeping them quiet, but the creature knows they're there. It keeps coming back to orbit the position. It hasn't committed to an approach yet. It is evaluating the terrain, looking for optimal approach vectors. She paused. Dex Volkov. Myra's jaw tightened. He went north about 20 minutes ago. Loud made himself visible trying to draw it off. She paused. It followed for a bit. Then it stopped and turned around and came back here. A predator sophisticated enough to identify a deliberate decoy and decline to be led. Something that could distinguish purposeful noise from incidental noise. That was not simple predatory reflex. That was something that sat closer to tactical reasoning than anything she had expected from an animal woken from 65 million years of dormancy. She looked at Myra's flare, then at the creek bed, then at the sky angle through the canopy. The light was going. In 3 hours it would be full dark, and a photonic camouflage predator in full dark had advantages she did not want to consider at length. How many flares do you have? 3 total. Give me 2. She moved up the creek bed in the most controlled way she could manage, which was not fast but was quiet. She was not trying to be invisible to the creature. At this range, on this terrain, that was not achievable, and the attempt would cost her attention she needed for navigation. She was trying to be uninteresting, to move in a way that communicated nothing dramatic, nothing that fit the profile of prey in flight. She had watched predators work. She had read the xenobiological literature on ambush hunting strategies. The trigger for a committed charge was not presence but behavioral profile, the specific movement signature of something that knew it was being hunted and was running from it. She moved like she was going somewhere, purposefully, with a destination. She found Corvin and the children exactly where Myra had said. The rock shelf was a genuine geological feature, a horizontal basalt intrusion in the limestone face of the creek bank, extending about 2 meters outward at a height of 1 meter off the creek bed floor, creating a cavity underneath that was essentially a 3-sided room with a rock ceiling. Corvin had situated all 3 of them at the back of this cavity, himself closest to the opening, which was both tactically sound and the instinct of a 14-year-old who had decided, at some point in the past 2 hours, to be the thing between harm and the people smaller than him. Sasha was 9, red-haired, the quietest child on the survey site, the one who communicated primarily through direct eye contact and carefully placed silences. She was sitting with her back against the rock wall with her arms wrapped around her own knees, and she looked at Velnara with an expression that didn't change in its surface composure, but that shifted fractionally in some quality. Velnara had taken 17 months to learn to read. Something in Sasha's eyes eased slightly. Petra was asleep. This was, Velnara had spent 2.5 seconds trying to categorize it. Either a miracle of developmental neurology, evidence that Petra's threat assessment machinery was significantly undercalibrated, or a testimony to Corvin's capacity to project calm so effectively that a 2.5-year-old had felt safe enough to stop being awake. She had not, ultimately, settled on a single explanation. Corvin looked at her the moment she appeared. His eyes did the same thing Sasha's did, that fractional ease, that small shift, like a valve releasing pressure. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. She had learned this from him specifically. He had explained at some point that hey was the informal hello and could also function as a checkpoint, a verification of presence, a small sound that meant I see you and you are here, and that is better than the alternative. She had come to understand why people needed small sounds like that. "It's still out there," he said, not a question. "It is circling the position. It has been doing this for some time." She crouched at the edge of the shelf's opening, keeping herself low. "Your mother is safe, 80 meters south on the dry creek bed. You mapped this sector." The flash of something that might have been pride, carefully managed. "For my independent geology project, I've been doing subsurface mapping of the upper lava tube system. I knew about the shelf from the karst topography analysis." "You did well," she said, and meant it with the full weight of the word. He looked at her, 14 years old, and looking at her the way he'd been looking at her for 17 months, like she was a colleague, like she was someone whose assessment meant something, like the thing she said had landed in a place where things that matter land. "What are you going to do?" he asked. She studied the creek bed, the limestone face, the angle of the karst fissures, the geological story this terrain was telling if you knew how to read it. "I am going to use the geology," she said. Corvin held her gaze for a moment. Something passed across his face that she could not have named precisely. Not quite trust, and not quite fear, and not quite something else, but a combination of all three that was specific to the moment of handing your safety to another person, and knowing you have no alternative and choosing anyway to hand it. He nodded. She looked at Petra, asleep in his lap, reached out with her better hand, the fractured right one, and let Petra's fingers close around two of hers for just a moment, the warmth of it as familiar now as the weight of the sensor array had been, which was itself a thought worth sitting with, the way the body learns what to expect from the world and then surprises you by expecting something new. She released. "When you hear the noise," she said, "go south. Straight south along the creek bed. Don't stop, don't look back, get to your mother." She left them before he could ask another question. Not because she didn't want to answer, but because the questions would keep coming as long as she was there to receive them, and she needed to move while the light was still useful. The north-south lava tube entrance was a sinkhole concealed beneath 3 seasons of accumulated leaf litter, which she had flagged in the survey maps as a potential ground crew hazard and had placed a perimeter marker around. The marker was still there, a small yellow stake, now partially overgrown. She found it by direction more than sight. She crouched at the edge of the sinkhole for 30 seconds, doing nothing but listening with the lateral line. The creature was approximately 80 meters northeast, still circling, still patient. She estimated, about 4 minutes before it registered her current position as a more interesting data point than the rock shelf. She was going to need fewer than 4 minutes. She went into the sinkhole feet first, dropping the 2 meters to the tube floor, rolling on the impact with the shoulder rather than the hands because the hands were not going to take that well. She came up moving. The tube was dark and the air smelled of ancient mineral water and the particular cold that lives in places the sun has never reached. She moved east along the tube floor, feeling the wall with one arm, counting steps to calibrate her position against the map she had memorized. The limestone plug was at the north end of the tube, which meant behind her now. She was moving away from it initially. She needed the creature to follow her in, and the creature needed to be between her and the plug when the plug went. She made noise. Not frantic noise, not prey-in-flight noise. Purposeful, directional noise that communicated something moving toward a specific destination, because a creature sophisticated enough to identify a decoy was also, she had theorized, sophisticated enough to recognize the difference between panic and intent. She had been in the tube for approximately 90 seconds when she felt the pressure change. It had dropped into the sinkhole behind her. 12 meters of prehistoric exoskeleton in a 6-meter diameter lava tube was not a comfortable fit. She could hear it now as well as feel it, the grinding of chitinous armor against basalt walls, the compression wave sound of something too large for the space it was occupying, pushing through anyway because 65 million years of being the apex predator of a world had not produced the habit of being stopped by mere spatial constraints. It was fast in the tube, faster than she had expected. The confinement did not slow it, the tube walls were acting as guides, and it was using them, flowing down the channel the way water flows when the channel tells it where to go. She ran. She ran the way she had theorized, not in flight, but toward, and the tube curved slightly north and she followed the curve, and she was running flat against the north wall now, running with one hand on the basalt, counting steps in her head, and behind her the pressure signature was enormous and close and still focused. The limestone plug appeared in her peripheral sensor range as a temperature differential in the wall, slightly warmer than the basalt, the limestone holding residual heat from the day above in a way that basalt didn't. She felt it before she saw it, and she had time to make 2 decisions in close sequence: where to press herself, and how to get the flares into the flaw line without losing her grip on the wall. She pressed against the eastern face of the tube at the plug junction, where the basalt met the limestone at the angle she had mapped, where the flaw line ran. She felt the flaw under her fingertips, a hairline separation, invisible in the dark, perceptible by pressure as a slight differential in the wall's response to her touch. The creature came around the last curve of the tube. She could see it now, or see what the compound eyes made of the dark. The gold of them had a faint bioluminescence that she had not expected, and they caught some trace of airflow light from the sinkhole entrance and held it. 65 million years of looking at the world through those eyes. 65 million years of being the thing that nothing else had ever survived meeting. She looked back. Not in defiance, not in the pose of a story about bravery. She looked back because the moment was real and she was in it, and the only honest thing to do with a real moment is to be in it completely. She lit both flares simultaneously, holding them together in her burned and broken hands, and drove them into the flaw line. The heat from 2 flares at that proximity was significant in a narrow enclosed space. She had known this. She had not known it precisely enough. The pain in both hands in the moment after ignition was severe enough to make her vision go white, and the reason she dropped the flares was not tactical, was simply that her hands stopped being able to hold them. They fell into the crack, which was what she had needed to happen. The heat went directly into the flaw. 2 million years of compressive geological stress, held at a steady tension by a limestone plug that had been waiting, in the way that rock waits, for the variable that would make the equation resolve. The plug blew inward. The hydrothermal pressure behind it had been building for 3 million years. Not explosively, rock doesn't work that way, but consistently, steadily, in the way that water always finds the path and then widens it, one molecule at a time, over geological time, until the path is wide enough for what's behind it. What was behind it was a column of mineral water at pressure that had nowhere to go but east. She was pressed against the eastern wall at the junction point. The water went east. Everything else in the tube that was not pressed against the eastern wall at the junction point also went east. She heard it, the collision of 65-million-year-old biology with 3-million-year-old hydrology. The sound was enormous in the confined space, a hammering pressure wave followed by the continuous roar of water moving at a rate that the tube had not seen since the lava that carved it was still hot. It went on for a long time. Then it began to slow. She stood in the dark with the water rising around her feet, cold, mineral, real, physical, and breathed. The pressure signature of the creature in her lateral line was moving east, away, carried by the water, and then not carried but moving on its own, driven by something that was older than strategy and closer to survival instinct. It was not destroyed. She had not, and this was important to be precise about, been trying to destroy it. She had been trying to move it. She started working east along the tube, feeling the wall, following the air pressure toward the karst vents that she knew from the survey maps emptied into the lower eastern drainage basin, 3 kilometers from the colony perimeter. Getting out was going to take a while. She surfaced 40 minutes later through a karst vent she had to widen with her shoulder, emerging into the night air with both hands in a condition she was categorizing as requiring professional attention, and the structural integrity of her lower thoracic plate, now officially a concern rather than a speculation. The stars on SL7 were different from the stars on Keth Solis, denser, brighter, an artifact of the colony world's position in the galactic arm, and she lay on her back for about 30 seconds looking at them. Then she got up and turned south. She heard them before she reached them. Voices, specific and human and unmistakably alive, Myra's voice, and a lower one that was Dex Volkov, who had apparently made it out of the northern jungle after all, and the higher, distinct voice of Corvin, and the absolute silence where Petra was either being carried or had gone back to sleep. She came through the last screen of undergrowth, and Corvin saw her. He was 14 years old and had been holding 3 children safe under a rock shelf for 2 hours, and had spent 40 minutes since then not knowing whether the plan had worked, and not knowing whether the person who had made the plan was alive. He came across the distance between them at a speed that was not quite a run, and she met him halfway because that was what you did. He grabbed her the way children grab things they were afraid they had lost. Both arms around her damaged torso, and she felt the pressure on the cracked plate and said nothing about it and put her one better arm around him and held on. He said nothing for a while. She said into the top of his head, "You did good work, knowing the geology." He made a sound that was not words and held on tighter. Behind him, Petra was awake now. She had been carried by Dex Volkov, who had returned from the northern jungle missing a boot, and with a spectacular bruise along his jawline and the particular expression of a man who has recently had to reconsider his theory of how dangerous things are. Petra looked at Velnara over Dex's shoulder with the serious assessment of a person who has just processed something large. Then she held out her arms. Velnara disentangled herself from Corvin, took Petra from Dex, held the small weight of her against her shoulder, where the cracked plate was, and felt Petra immediately go still with the trust of a child who has already decided this is a safe place. Myra Adami said, very quietly to no one in particular, "I need to sit down." They all eventually sat down. The consortium containment team arrived 6 days later, which felt like a long time and also felt like the exact right amount of time. Long enough that the emergency had space to become a story, to acquire the particular quality that difficult things acquire when they are past and people are talking about them, the slight unreality that comes from survival. Velnara spent those 6 days in the colony medical bay, which she had never been inside before because she had never been injured before. The human medical staff, there were 3 of them, 2 nurses and a physician named Dr. Asari, who had been colony physician for 8 years, had clearly never treated a SS patient before, and approached the task with a combination of clinical diligence and the human quality that Velnara was still finding precise vocabulary for. They brought her things. They checked on her at intervals that were more frequent than strictly medically indicated. The nurse named B sat with her the second night for 2 hours without particular reason, working on her own tablet, simply present, and when Velnara pointed out that this wasn't necessary, B said she knew that and stayed anyway. The burned right hand required more work than the fractured left. The cracked thoracic plate, once confirmed by the imaging, required a specific pressure dressing that Dr. Asari had to improvise from equipment designed for human anatomy, which she did with a thoroughness that was genuinely impressive. The sensor array housing would need to be ordered from the consortium supply depot and would take 6 weeks. On day 3, Myra Adami came with Corvin and Sasha and Petra, and Corvin stood in the doorway of the medical bay looking like a boy who had rehearsed something and forgotten it, and eventually said, "I wanted to bring you something, but I didn't know what you would want." "You brought yourself," she said. "That is what I wanted." He looked at her for a moment. Then he came and sat in the chair beside the bed, and took out his geological survey notes, and showed her the work he had been doing on the upper sector lava tube mapping, and asked her questions about the tube formation process for an hour and a half. And this was, she recognized, his way of saying whatever he needed to say without having the vocabulary for it yet, and she recognized it because she had been doing the same thing for 17 months. Petra, as noted, took her coat. The consortium review board filed their assessment 9 weeks after the incident. Velnara was cleared. The language of the board's findings was careful in the way that language is careful when the people writing it are having to revise a position that had felt settled. But the core finding was unambiguous. The operational outcome, including 0 colonist casualties, was directly attributable to geological expertise built through extended community integration. This integration, upon review, was consistent with established best practices for long-duration colonial survey postings. She read this in the main survey building, while Corvin ran seismic analyses at the next workstation and Dex argued with the supply depot on the radio about a shipment timeline, and the coffee sat, as always, at her workstation. And she had not, this time, mentioned to Dev that caffeine did not metabolize correctly in this physiology. She had decided, some weeks ago, to simply let the coffee be there. It didn't mean what it was supposed to mean medically. It meant something else. She had decided that the something else was worth more than the accuracy. The creature was in the East Valley Containment Facility, which had been constructed with the input of the survey team and managed by a joint consortium colonial committee, and Velnara had been appointed by the Science Division, with the colony's enthusiastic endorsement, as primary behavioral consultant. She had been spending her mornings there. She had been learning things. The creature she had mentally categorized in the tube as a hunter, a predator, an engine of 65-million-year-old need, she was revising this. The creature was a hunter, but it was also something else, and the something else was what she spent her mornings in the observation blind studying. It moved its rocks. It arranged flat stones in configurations that corresponded, as far as she could determine, to thermal optimization and light angle. It tracked every drone that passed over the containment zone with both raptorial arms, in the posture, she had learned, was not preparation for attack but preparation for defense. It returned daily to the southeastern quadrant of the containment zone, to a specific 40-square-meter area adjacent to the second basalt outcropping, where it would stand for varying periods of time and simply be present. She flagged this in her report. She requested a soil analysis. The team went in with Grandma watching them from 40 meters away, with the focused attention of a creature that was entirely capable of covering 40 meters extremely quickly if it chose to, and chose, currently, not to choose. Dr. Ewan from the Regional Xenobiology Station stood next to Velnara at the edge of the excavation, and watched his team carefully remove 2 meters of compacted mineral clay, working slowly, with the delicacy of archaeologists who understood that what they were looking for was not an object but a fact. They found the chemical trace at 2 meters and 12 centimeters. The instruments confirmed it: chitin membrane residue preserved by mineral replacement over 65 million years of geological time, arranged in the configuration that the analytical model identified with high confidence as an egg clutch. Not viable, not even close to viable, not biological material in any meaningful current sense, but arranged, placed, oriented, put there by something that had understood 65 million years ago what they were and what they were for. Dr. Ewan said very quietly she was a mother. Velnara stood at the edge of the excavation and looked at the chemical trace of something that had been waiting for 65 million years to hatch. She looked at the creature watching them from 40 meters away, the raptorial arms raised in that posture she knew now: not threat, not attack, not the instinct of a predator, the posture of something guarding. Still guarding. After 65 million years, still guarding what it could not save. She wrote a page and a half in her evening report that night, under a section heading she worked on for 40 minutes before she was satisfied with it. Subject demonstrates primary drive state consistent with maternal behavior rather than predatory behavior. The raptorial defensive posture is site attachment protective, not threat response aggressive. The site attachment behavior is targeted specifically at the location of the fossilized egg clutch. Metabolic dormancy over 65 million years did not extinguish this drive state. It preserved it in essentially unmodified form. What we are observing is not a threat that requires containment management. What we are observing is a grief that has been waiting for 65 million years for something to change. The question before the Science Division is whether we have the capacity to offer what was taken. I believe we do. I believe it is the correct application of that capacity. I recommend we begin genetic analysis immediately. She filed the report at 2300 hours and went back to the medical bay to have her plate dressing changed. And in the hallway outside the medical bay, leaning against the wall with a thermos of something hot that was probably tea, was Corvin Adami, who was supposed to be in bed. "What are you doing here?" she said. "Couldn't sleep," he said. He held out the thermos. "It's tea, not caffeine, I checked." She looked at the thermos for a moment. Then she took it. It was warm in her hands, even the bad ones. She held it and stood next to him in the hallway and looked out the window at the long spine against the night sky. "Do you think she'll be okay?" he asked. He didn't specify who he meant. "I think," she said carefully, "that we are going to try to help her. I think that is the correct thing to try." He nodded. He was quiet for a while. Then, "I keep thinking about what it must have been like, waking up after all that time, everything different." She thought about waking up in a world 60 light years from your own, about reaching into a crate of core samples and having a child grab your hand to show you a green beetle in the clay, about learning, incrementally and without planning to, what it meant to be somewhere rather than simply stationed there. "I imagine," she said, "it is something like arriving somewhere you did not expect to call home, and then gradually understanding that you do." He looked at her. She looked at the long spine. After a while he said, "Are you going to stay after the contract ends?" She had been thinking about this. She had been thinking about it with increasing specificity over the past 3 weeks, in the way you think about a thing when you are not quite ready to say it out loud but are beginning to practice saying it to yourself. "Yes," she said. It was the first time she had said it to another person. He made a sound that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction but somewhere between them, and she recognized it because she was making the same sound, internally, in the this register that humans couldn't hear. There was one more thing she did that week, which she had not planned and which surprised her by feeling necessary. She went to see Pear of House Adathi, the consortium containment team lead, who was staying in the colony's secondary administrative building while she finalized the operational reports and coordinated the transfer of site management to the science division's long-term team. Pear was a careful professional who had done her job well and who had, during the review board period, been placed in the uncomfortable position of representing an institution that was reconsidering conclusions it had been confident about. She had done this with competence and without apparent resentment. Velnara found her at the end of the second week, packing her field kit in the building's main room, preparing to return to the regional station. "I wanted to tell you something," Velnara said. "Before you go." Pear looked up, set down the field kit component she was holding, waited. "The review board's revised finding," Velnara said. "That deep integration with colonial populations is consistent with best survey practices for long-duration postings." "Yes, I think they are right, but I want to be precise about why, because the finding as written describes it as instrumental, as something that produces better operational outcomes, which is true but not complete." She thought about how to say the next part. She had been thinking about it for several days, and she had the phrasing now. "The humans I work with here are not a data resource I was accessing for operational advantage. They are people I have come to know. Knowing them changed me. It made me more capable, yes, but it also made me someone different from who I was when I arrived. And the person I am now is better at the work not because I have more data but because I have more investment. I am more afraid of losing them. That fear is not a liability. It is the most operationally significant thing about me." Pear was quiet for a moment. She had the particular stillness of a this who is processing something that did not arrive in the expected form. "You are saying the bond is the capability," she said finally. "I am saying the bond and the capability are not separable. The review board's framing still treats them as separable. It says, the integration produced better outcomes. I am saying, the integration is the outcome. Everything else follows from it." Pear looked at her for a long time. Then she picked up the field kit component she had set down and returned to her packing. She said, without looking up, "I am going to include this in my own report, in my own words. I will note the source." Vilnara nodded. "That's all I wanted." She left Pear to her packing and walked out into the morning. There was a ceremony, in the third week after the containment team's departure, that no one had formally organized, but that happened anyway in the way that human communities produce ceremonies when something large enough has occurred. Informally, collectively, with food and noise, and a great deal of talking that circled around the thing without naming it directly, until it had been named from so many angles that it was named. It was in the main survey building in the evening, and it involved most of the survey team and their families, and a number of colony residents who had come up from the lower settlement after hearing the story. And there was food, which humans produced in large quantities when they wanted to say something they didn't have words for. Vilnara stood in the middle of it for about an hour, holding a plate of things she had gradually learned to eat over 17 months of being offered them by people who wanted to share, and she looked around at the room and thought, "This is what a community looks like from the inside." She had been on the outside of many things in her life, not through deliberate exclusion. The this did not exclude exactly. They maintained. They maintained professional distances and appropriate separations and the sovereign territories of their own bodies and their own purposes, and this was correct and functional and produced competent survey work on 8 colonial postings over 11 years, and she had been good at it, and it had been enough. It had been enough the way having enough food is enough. You don't go hungry. You continue. But it is a different thing from a meal someone made because they wanted to sit across a table from you and watch your face while you tasted it. Dev Osei found her at some point in the second hour, which was so much like him, showing up precisely when the moment called for it, without announcement, without formality. "You're staying," he said. He made it a statement rather than a question, which meant he already knew. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "The consortium contract renewal process is, I assume you know it's complicated. Stays beyond the initial contract period require regional approval, and I have already begun the paperwork." He stopped, looked at her. "You started the paperwork before you told anyone." "I told Corvin." Dev looked across the room to where Corvin was having an animated conversation with 2 of the other survey team members about the lava tube mapping project, which he had apparently decided to expand significantly based on the events of the past 3 weeks. He had the look of a 14-year-old who has discovered that a thing they were doing for personal interest has turned out to matter to the world. Dev said, "That kid is going to be extraordinary." "Yes," she said, "he is already." Dev was quiet for a moment. Then, "The coffee, you never said anything for months." "I know what you were doing. I did not want to make it stop." He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to recognize as the human face that happened when something was being understood for the first time that had been true for a long time. "You could have just said." "I know," she said. "I am saying it now." He was quiet for another moment. Then he did the thing that she had learned over 17 months to expect from Dev, which was that he did not make it sentimental, did not make it large, did not reach for the rhetoric of the moment. He just nodded and looked at the room and said, "I'll keep leaving it anyway, in case. In case. In case you change your mind." She looked at the coffee, she looked at the room. She looked at Petra asleep in her mother's arms in the corner, at Sasha sitting next to Corvin, and watching the conversation with the silent intensity of a child who is learning everything, at Dex Volkov, who had never fully gotten over the wonder of having survived a walk in the jungle with a 65-million-year-old predator, and seemed to have concluded that this was the correct attitude to take toward most things from now on. She thought about the creature in the East Valley, standing over her 65-million-year-old grief, still guarding what she could not save. She thought about the genetic analysis report, and the word possible, and what it meant that something that had been impossible for 65 million years was becoming possible now. She thought, the correct attitude to take toward most things is that they might, if you stay long enough and care enough and learn enough, become possible. Leave the coffee, she said. In the East Valley, the long night moved over the containment zone. Grandma stood in the southeastern quadrant, raptorial arms raised slightly, gold compound eyes scanning a darkness she could see better than anything watching her from outside. Standing over something that was already lost. Still standing over it. The gesture was 65 million years old, and it was still the same gesture. I was here, and I am still here, and this matters to me, and mattering to me is the only thing I have left to offer it. The science division's preliminary genetic analysis results had come back that afternoon. Not conclusive, not a commitment, but a beginning, a pathway, a possible direction. Something that started with "we think it might be possible" and ended with "we think it is worth trying." Velnara had read the analysis twice, and then walked to the East Valley overlook and stood there for a while, looking at the creature in the last evening light. She thought about a boy with engine grease on his nose, showing her a green beetle in the clay, both of his small hands wrapped around her long fingers. She thought about mud offered as a gift, utterly without irony, with all the sincerity of a person who has decided that the most beautiful thing they have is good enough for you. She thought 65 million years is a long time to wait. She thought, but something waited. And now something is here to find it waiting. She turned and walked back down off the overlook, through the last of the evening light, into the colony's yellow windows, where people were making dinner and arguing about supply schedules, and doing homework and asking each other questions, and being alive in the particular complicated way that you are alive when you have survived something together and decided to keep going. She walked into the light. She was going to stay.